Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG, coming at you with another deep dive look at a Pioneer deck. This time we are choosing to look at Blue-White Control. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these deep dive looks at card choices of decks, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below, as we aim to be the most informative Pioneer channel on YouTube. So, with Blue-White Control, things have to get divided up a little bit because there are two variants of Blue-White Control that you'll see. That is the Yorion and the non-Yorion versions. So sometimes you'll see larger number of cards, or you'll see card choices that you might not see otherwise in the deck when you're choosing to play 80 cards over 60 cards. So first up, we're going to take a look at a couple different Yorion builds, discuss some of the card choices in them, and then kind of build off from there on the 60 card versions. So with the 80 card versions, obviously you have to run more cards. So you're going to see more copies of cards you aren't going to see normally, or cards you might see in the sideboard of the 60 card version you might see in the main deck. First off, Blue-White Control is a control deck. They aim to interact with your opponent early, eventually take over the game with card advantage, and Blue-White is the epitome of that particular style. It's gotten some new tools in recent sets, including the Wandering Emperor, March of Otherworldly Light, and Portable Hull, which is put in a much better position than it used to be, as Blue-White Control tended to suffer from good sweepers, poor removal problem. Now it has decent removal, good sweepers, making it one of the better decks to handle most of the creature decks in the format. As far as Blue-White Control, you start out with the early interaction. In the 80 card version, you have Portable Hull, which allows you to exile anything with mana value 2 or less. Not only is this valuable against the creature decks, it's also valuable against some of the Rakdos decks with Witch's Oven or Anvil, etc. Allows you to have some early interaction for that. This is a card that doesn't see a ton of play in the 60 card version in the main deck, but you know, when you're filling out 80 cards with a Yorion, it's a card you're going to see a lot of. Other interaction pieces you will see is cards like Faithful Absence. While it does give your opponent a clue, this is one of the more efficient ways to deal with a planeswalker or a creature. You know, oftentimes, especially against early aggressive decks, you're just trying to stay alive. They're not always going to have the time to crack those clues in the early turn before you start taking over the game. So, while this is a downside, it is very powerful. And the best removal spell they've gotten lately is March of Otherworldly Light, which allows you to exile a artifact, creature, or enchantment for value X mana or less, and you can choose to exile a white card from your hand to reduce the mana cost by 2. This is also another very useful tool, especially being an instant speed. Allows you to interact with your opponent's creatures much more effectively, giving you a little bit more of a heads up against some of the aggressive decks, especially that used to be able to get under this deck. As far as other disruption, you have Jawari Disruption here, which could also be considered in your land pile. This is basically Force Spike, 1 in a blue, or Force Spike was just a blue, but this is 1 in a blue, counter target spell unless they play 1, or if your opponent's playing around this effect, you can easily play it as a tap land on a turn where your mana lines up whenever you're trying to go, you know, say, holding up an Absorb on like turn 4. Speaking of Absorb, this is kind of the all-purpose counter spell. Basically, it's between this and Dissolve, whether you want to play the life gain or you want the Surveil 1. Most people choose to play Absorb, as it gives you a little bit of a life buffer against the aggressive decks, which can be very important, as mono red is one of the ways to attack this deck in terms of a deck that can go under it before you're completely set up with your defenses. And Dovin's Veto is kind of your catch-all negate when you're in the colors blue and white, as opposed to, say, blue-black or something. It's just the better counter spell. Allows you to hard counter anything, no matter how many counter spells your opponent has. You know, allows you to deal with your opponent's threats that aren't a card that we'll get into in the sideboards, which is the Hullbreaker Horror, which is kind of the mirror breaker for the control decks. Beyond that, you start getting into your other bits of interaction. You have Supreme Verdict, which is just the best sweeper in the format in terms of rate and uncounterability. And then another new piece to the thing is Farewell. While Farewell is a little bit slow, it does allow you to clean up a lot of problematic permanents, especially against those Rakdos decks that we've already kind of mentioned, or any kind of food decks that might be running around, whether they might be on a Corvold build or they might be on a Bolas Citadel build. This allows you to kind of clean up everything in those decks except for Planeswalkers, but they don't tend to play a lot of those. So this allows you to clean up everything as well as exile and graveyards, which can be relevant in some spots. Beyond that, you start getting into your card advantage things. Narset, Parter of Veils. This card is particularly important against other controlling decks and against the various Izzet piles, including Phoenix. Makes it very difficult for them to cantrip. Helps to shut off their treasure cruises and such, while also being a source of card advantage. In those matchups, especially against the damage-based decks, you may not always down tick it to just force your opponent to be able to interact with it, and if they can't attack it down or burn it out, then they're going to have problems with their deck functioning. And it's also very good in the control mirrors, as just come down, double impulse, and keeping your opponent from cantripping. Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, probably the stalwart of the deck. This is a card that's been through its various incarnations. It's been a powerhouse since it's been in Standard. It's even seen some fringe play in the modern variant of blue-white control, which is obviously has more efficient answers and such, but still occasionally sees play in that format, so obviously it's a very powerful card. Allows you to plus to draw cards, -3 to tuck anything, and then it's -8 whenever you draw a card, exile to a permanent. This can be a win con in and of itself, especially when you get into the later game if you've exhausted most of your threats. You can start tucking Teferi itself to make your library bottomless, which obviously a little bit less of a problem when you're playing 80 cards, but it can be a win con in and of itself. And then Memory Deluge. This is kind of your card draw spell. Blue-white control is not particularly good at putting cards in the graveyard, so things like Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time are not as good in this type of archetype. This is where, the format not having fetch lands makes it kind of shows the power of not having fetch lands in the format, by Memory Deluge being the card selection spell that blue-white control chooses over, very powerful delve spells in Dig Through Time and blue-white Treasure Cruise. As far as closing out the game in the main deck, this deck has access to the Wandering Emperor, another new tool from recent sets here in Kamigawa particularly. It comes down at instant speed, allows you to have an instant speed threat to kind of tax your opponent's mana in the control mirror, while also being quite good against the creature decks, whether it be exiling a creature, making a surprise blocker out of nowhere, and then just creating an army in a can to kind of jumble things up, maybe force your opponent to play more into a sweeper. And then in the main deck of the Urion build, you get to play more copies of Shark Typhoon. Oftentimes you can hard cast Shark Typhoon in the late game, start making a bunch of sharks, kind of taking over the game from there. But a lot of times, especially in the early turns, you're going to be cycling this to hit your land drops while also creating a value shark to either interact with your opponent's planeswalkers, maybe to attack them down, force your opponent to play around it as far as their attacks and stuff if they're a more aggressive deck. And also, in the late game, you can make an absurdly large shark and suddenly kill them out of nowhere. That's pretty much what's in the main deck. Talking about the mana base a little bit. So for having come largely from the modern format, the mana is a little bit goofy in these decks. Oftentimes you need double white on turn 3, or on turn 4 you need double blue on turn 3. So despite playing all the duels that this deck does, sometimes the mana can be a little bit of an issue, whether it's not drawing enough lands, drawing the wrong color of lands, etc. This deck tries to utilize about as many duels as you can. That's why you're seeing it play Irrigated Farmland, you're seeing it play Hallowed Fountain, Glacial Fortress, Deserted Beach. You're seeing it play a lot of dual lands, you're seeing it play the Pathways, you're seeing it play Hall of the Storm Giants, etc. So you get to play a lot of utility lands in your mana base, but you're effectively playing plains and islands with upside. Castle Ardenvale allows you to make soldiers, just white human creature tokens. Castle Vantress gives you a little bit of card selection. Iganjo allows you to interact with your opponent's creatures if they're attacking or blocking, or just be playing a land drop. Field of Ruin, a lot of decks aren't playing basics, especially the 3 and 4 color decks, so sometimes you can kind of color screw your opponent. Oftentimes this really isn't a lot of value lands in the format other than something like Nykthos out of mono green. So, it's not as powerful as it is in, say, a format like Modern or etc. But, a lot of people don't run basics, so sometimes this can just be a getcha. Or it helps you fix your mana if you're missing a white or a blue source, although a little bit slow. Then you have access to Otawaro, another interaction potential piece. Allows you to bounce a permanent, or basically an artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker back to its owner's hand. And, you're playing some amount of islands and plains to be able to turn on your various things, as well as having access to things if your opponent starts land destructing you with, like, say, a Cleansing Wildfire crazy build that I've seen out there at points. But basically, you're playing 36 lands with the Jawari Disruptions, so sometimes that's not enough lands, but, this is a very mana-hungry deck and does like to hit its land drops early, and, you do have some utility with your cycling lands and some of your other mana sinks in the mid to late game. As far as sideboard options for this particular version, obviously, we didn't talk about Yorion. Yorion is a reason to play Omen in the Sea, which is a card I forgot to mention. This is a card that comes down, allows you to scry 2, then draw a card. Then you can sack it later to scry 2. Yorion is an additional threat that you get to basically play for free. It allows you to turn on some of your other things, like blinking some of your, say, Teferi after you've down-ticked it, your Narsets after you down-tick them, Omen of the Seas, while also having a card that you can pitch to March of Otherworldly Light in a pinch. So obviously very powerful, and most of the lists that I've seen that have been doing well recently do play Yorion, but I did find a couple lists that don't. Doan's Veto, we already kind of covered that in the main deck. Bring this in against the control matchups, as well as any matchups where you expect there to be a lot of non-creature spells, whether it be Lotus Field combo, etc. This just gives you another hard counter in those style of matchups. Mystical Disputes, this is largely here for the blue mirrors, whether it be control or the various Izzet piles, whether it be Izzet control or Arclight Phoenix. Narset's Reversal, this one's a little bit unique. Really, there's only 2 cards you really want to hit with this. The main one being Thought Distortion out of the Lotus Field decks, or another opposing control deck, especially blue-black. But it's also can hit Storm the Festival, and you do have enough permanence in your deck that you're going to get enough value off of that. So the Wreckage is a harder to play around sweeper, especially when you're already playing the main deck, Supreme Verdicts and Farewells. This kind of gives you the instant speed answer to, am I playing Settle the Wreckage, am I playing the Wandering Emperor, forces the opponent to play around a different myriad of spells and just supplements your sweepers in the main deck. Sunset Revelry, this is mainly here for the opposing aggressive decks, mono red in particular, but, can do it in a pinch against a lot of other decks, mono black, if you happen to see that. It's okay against Winota, not the best, but it does give you a couple chump blockers, maybe buy you a little bit of time. And then Rest in Peace, this is primarily here for Phoenix. Phoenix and a little bit of Mardu Greasefang, or the various Greasefang variants. This comes down, shuts down their graveyard shenanigans, basically shuts down the recursion of both those decks and forces them to play a fair game, of which you tend to be very well equipped to answer. Alright, looking at another Yorion list. This one you're seeing a lot of the same cards in the main deck. Nothing really stands out here in the main deck other than the addition of Sparrow's Headquarters, which this is just another cycling land. You can have any of the blue-white dual lands, whether it be the Jeskai one or the Bant one basically here. You can even play the Esper one if you wanted to mess with your opponent a little bit. Doesn't really add anything in particular other than it just gives you another cycling land whenever you're in the mid to late game and you're finally hitting enough land drops and you just want a little bit of utility out of your lands. You're seeing a little bit different numbers, as far as the disruptions, the memory deluges, shark typhoons, etc. So a little bit of different packages. One more copy of Fateful Absence, cutting a portable hull here. Nothing too particularly special with this particular version as far as the main deck. But what we really wanted to cover was in the sideboard. Seeing a lot of the same cards. Another interaction spell you see here is Aethergust. This is good against the Mono Green Devotion and Winota decks that we've covered already. In addition to something like Sunset Revelry, this gives you the ability to instant speed interact with those. And it looks like they've given up some of their interaction for the control matchups to be able to bring that in. The 2 cards that I really wanted to focus on in this version, though, was Dream Trawler. This is a card that can come down and just dominate the board against aggressive decks, especially something like Mono Red, which, once again, if you're looking to beat this deck, 2 ways to do it are to go under it and go over it. Go under it, Mono Red, kind of one of your better things to do that. But this is a card that you can just tap out. It has lifelink, pseudo hexproof and forces your opponent to attack through it. It's very good at beating traditional creature decks that aren't Winota. Hullbreaker Horror, this is primarily here for the control mirrors, as control mirrors often come down to who has access to Hullbreaker Horror and who doesn't. This is a very difficult card to deal with. But if you aren't able to untap with it, you basically almost never lose. Basically this is the control mirror breaker. If you want to beat the control mirror, generally you want to play at least 2 of these, but, having access to one in your 75, or in this case 95, is not a terrible idea. But that said, let's look at some of the 60 card versions and see how they differ. As I mentioned in the opening deck rant, that when you're playing the 60 card version, you're going to be often playing a lot of the same cards, but cutting a lot of the same things. I think this is a pretty good example. One of the things you'll note in this particular version is they're not playing just Jawari Disruption, instead they're playing a Censor. So you either get to play a Force Spike early on, well, pseudo Force Spike obviously being 1 mana, or with the ability to cycle it later. So not as much utility as the land versus, the same thing, but does allow you to cycle, potentially hit your land drops. This version is playing 3 Supreme Verdicts and 1 Farewell. They trim on things like Narset and Memory Deluge as you're kind of narrowing down the things you have access to. One card that I wanted to mention that is not covered in any of the lists that I found, and it is something you can consider, is Azorius Charm. This is a card that can allow you to put a creature back on top of your opponent's library, draw a card, or if you have some tokens running around from Sharp Typhoon and such, or from the Wandering Emperor, it can allow you to gain some life link and get a life buffer against some of the aggressive decks. This is one of the other better removal choices, in addition to Fateful Absence, Portable Hole, and a March of Otherworldly Light. It is something you can have access to and allows you to cantrip to hit your land drops, which can be very important in the control mirrors. One thing you will note with this is there are no copies of Shark Typhoon in the main deck. That is one of the cards you tend to get away with playing a little bit more in the 80 card version. And as far as the sideboard, once again you're seeing a lot of the same cards, except for you're seeing some of the cards that might be in the main deck of the 80 card deck shifted to the sideboard, so you have a little bit less room. And then you're only playing like 2 copies of Rest in Peace versus 3 that we saw. You're still playing, Shark Typhoon and Hullbreaker Horror as kind of your control breakers, and then Dovin's Veto obviously comes in against the other control decks. And let's take a look at one more 60 card list. This one I found really interesting because they were able to fit in a lot of, things that were missing in the other version, like Shark Typhoon. You still have 4 copies of March of Otherworldly Light. One thing this is giving up on, it's a little bit giving up on some of the earlier interaction. You're only seeing 2 copies of Fateful Absence, 2 copies of Censor. Still only seeing 26 lands. One of the things I really noted whenever I was playing the deck is you kind of struggle hitting your land drops sometimes, so sometimes you might want to go with 27 or 28. Obviously this cuts in the number of spells you're able to run, but if you can't cast those spells, a lot of people like to shave their lands, but in the reality I think you should add probably 1 more land to a lot of these lists. 2 Supreme Verdicts, 2 Farewells, not sure, depends on how fast the format is that you're playing against. I'd probably go with 3 Verdict, 1 Farewell, maybe a second Farewell on the board. But the main reason I chose this list was some of the unique cards in the sideboard. This version has 2 copies of Dream Trawler, obviously very good against the creature decks, has the Hullbreaker Horror, has the 4 copies of Mystical Dispute, so pretty well set up in the control mirror. Deafening Silence, this is primarily here, I would presume, for Phoenix and Lotus Field, as Lotus Field can be, from what I've read, a difficult matchup. I have not exactly run against it myself. Doesn't seem to be many people playing it whenever I've played the deck, but it does help in both of those style matchups. You could also play Damping Sphere, but Damping Sphere a little bit easier to interact with for those decks. And what I found interesting was Knockout Blow. This is very much a card targeted at Winota. This spell costs 2 less to cast, but targets a red creature. Knockout Blow deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature, and you gain 2 life. Actually, no, it's not that good against Winota, because it doesn't kill Winota before it gets triggers. But, it can be pretty good against mono red. which the Sunset Revelries would probably be the cards you'd be playing in this slot otherwise. So that's kind of the different things I've seen of the different variants. As far as how to attack the deck and how to sideboard, obviously, if you're playing against creature decks, you're going to shave on a little bit of your card advantage. You're going to shave on a little bit of your counter spells, especially stuff like censor and stuff, especially on the draw. You're going to bring in your removal and your additional interaction, whether it be Ether Gust or any type of additional removal spells or any additional sweepers you might have. Against control decks, you're going to shave on your removal, your sweepers, and bring in your counter spells and your additional threats. Blue-white control is very fluid with how you sideboard. Mainly you're shaving the answers that are bad, bringing in better answers, and sometimes you're bringing in additional threats if they happen to line up in the matchup, like Dream Troll against creature decks, Hullbreaker Horror against control decks, etc. Wandering Emperor just is a good catch-all if you happen to have it in the sideboard, as we saw on that one list. Shark Typhoon when you need additional threats, as well as also additional win cons, mainly in the grindy matchups. So if you want to beat blue-white control, there's a couple of ways to attack it. Obviously, something like Lotus Field kind of goes way over the top of what it does. This deck doesn't have a ton to interact with it other than counter spells, and oftentimes they can just set up, go get Thought Distortion, blow you out, and then win that way, especially since blue-white does not have a particularly fast clock. But the other things from watching other people play the deck and playing the deck a little bit myself, very low to the ground aggro decks like blue-white control, like mono red. To a certain extent, the Auras deck, if it's built correctly, whether they have some counterspell disruption in the sideboard or some timely discard spells, both those decks can kind of get under you with what you're doing, put a fast clock on you, and kill you. A good Winota player can cause you some fits, although that matchup seems to be pretty reasonable. One of the bigger reasons to play with blue-white control if you're expecting a lot of Winota. And the other thing is, blue-white historically is one of the weaker control decks in the mirror. Whether it be a lack of uncounterable threats, something like something like Niv Mizzet, or something like the Days Undoing Narset combo, or just lack of good removal. Blue-black tends to be the better control mirror deck, simply because they have better removal, so you're not having to leave in things like Fateful Absence and March of Otherworldly Light. You're able to have things like Hero's Downfall, or just one-for-one answers that are much more efficient and much better at what they do. Blue-white's a little bit better at answering, obviously, permanents like enchantments and artifacts. So, overall, while it balances out against the meta better, it tends to be one of the weaker colors in the mirror. So beware of things like Dimir or Is It control mirrors, as those can often be often a struggle, especially if you're not packing Hullbreaker Horror. So basically, if you want to beat it, go under it, go over the top of it. There isn't a ton that can go over the top of it. Mono green can to a certain degree, although blue-white can potentially answer their things with the right mix of counter spells and such. So that matchup has a little bit of back and forth to it, depending on their starts and your starts. Basically, you want to be blue-white control, do what you do in any other format, go under it or go over it. That's pretty much it for the deck. It is a very powerful deck, has a lot of answers. It's gotten a lot of powerful cards recently. So if you happen to like controlling the game, this is probably your best option. Although obviously, it has come and gone in terms of bouncing around for a couple weeks there in the format where it was the go-to control deck. It's a little bit better in the mirror. But overall, I would say blue-white control is probably the best control deck against the format overall. So, give this deck a try if you like those kind of decks. And don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hope to see you for the next video.